Good day, listeners. I am Ryan Todd, your host of Beyond the Checkbox, where we talk to frontline mental health leaders and HR professionals so we can gain a little more information, be a little sharper in our practice, and also help the employees that we work with. Today, we have Stephen Fletcher, who is the CHRO of a very old, well-established, well-known company called Canada Cartage, and they do transportation. Now, transportation is very interesting because it is an old industry and it's facing all of these new pressures. So, what I wanted to ask Stephen is what are the principles that you use that you've used for the last 20 years to carry the company forward to help with things like mental health and employee engagement and absenteeism? I really like what he had to say about having an origin story. Canada Cartage has an excellent origin story, and I think you'll really appreciate it as well. I hope you enjoy the episode, and thanks for joining. I'm Dr. Ryan Todd, a psychiatrist with over a decade of experience. And in this series with leading experts, we will explore the complexities of mental health, breakthrough therapies, and today's hottest topics. This is Beyond the Checkbox, Mind Masters. And just trying to talk to leaders who've been in the field for many years. And from what I can read, you've been in HR for 20 years now, 20 plus.
Yeah, over 25 now, I think. So it's been some time for sure. My first role was in hospitals, managing HR in a hospital group, and then moved to a municipality, and then to post-secondary education, then did the swap over to the private sector. So environmental services and now transportation. So it's been a great ride.
That's interesting because like with our organization, we do most of our business in those areas like healthcare, post-secondary, municipalities, sort of government, nonprofit, sport. Like what ties those things together? I have a theory of what ties them together. But I want to get from your perspective, what are the similarities there? Because I imagine the HR challenges were similar across those three groups.
Yeah, I like from an HR or people perspective, I mean, there are a lot of similarities. People generally want the same things. They want to do meaningful work. They want to have purpose. They want to contribute to society as a whole, and so that is a common thread throughout. The real differences are on the public sector side, so hospitals and municipalities, and there's always the bump up against finite budgets versus the institutional nature of those organizations. And so because they're funded sometimes, certainly in part or in whole by government, there's a view to they'll always be there. And that's not the case in the private sector. And so you have a different set of pressures that have to be navigated in dealing with people and keeping them engaged, and just by nature of those businesses.
Nature of the businesses or like the public entities? Because I wonder about the
Sure.
pressures of employees who I kind of straddle both of these worlds, right? Because I'm a doctor still, and I see the public system. No matter what happens or how incredible I am or terrible, the hospital that I work at will be here 500 years from now. If I'm really bad with
That's right.
Headversity, it's not. Like, it's just simply not. And so I do wonder what the different types of pressures are. And then in turn, what are some of the different sorts of, I don't know, complaints and grievances, and like what do people have angst about?
Yeah, well, and that's probably where some of the commonalities come in. I think people face the same general pressures in society. I think there's probably more job security in the public world, for sure. But I think all people end up facing the same pressures. It's at the we're living in very much an unprecedented time, and probably in every page of history, that's what people would say. We're living under unprecedented times, but we're coming out of a pandemic. The last one was the early 1900s. It's created different types of economic pressures, inflationary pressures, family pressures, work pressures. You have profit pressures from a business perspective, and all these things mount up and really have a big impact on the way people see the world and how they interpret that world, as it relates to their employment. And so we're finding more and more that the personal world and the professional world are starting to converge, and it's you know something that affects somebody's mental health, some of the or their physical health at home will affect what's going on at work, or relationship pressures in their personal life will affect what's going on in work. And so I think that's a common thing across all of those sectors. Um, so that's something that we have to deal with more and more in public or in the private sector.
And you would see that even in, not even in, but in addition to transport, similar how you'd see that in healthcare.
Yeah, for sure. And so, I mean, the differences in transport versus healthcare. So, my wife actually works in healthcare as well, so very familiar with that from both a professional perspective, but also from my wife's perspective. And the healthcare side is always facing budgetary pressures, the constant grind, and kind of the degradation of the healthcare kind of infrastructure, and that's a massive problem that is not easy to solve. And so the employees feel that from day to day. In the transport world, it's interesting because there are similar pressures in that um, there's been a freight recession for the last 30 months where we have seen downward pressure on the transport industry in terms of pricing and volumes and so on and so forth. And employees, that again, not easy to solve for. And employees have to kind of work through all of that in addition to their own kind of personal situations. So those aspects are similar. It just depends on the industry you're in.
How do you help with that? Like you as a HR professional, as an HR leader, there's what I find is a frustrating thing about HR is so many of, well, not so many, all of the human issues, the people issues kind of get laid at your feet. And they're like, fix
Mhm.
this, like fix macroeconomics of transport in North America. It's impossible. And so that's maybe what attracted me to HR, because that's psychiatry as well, right? Like a lot of the stuff that we
Yes.
deal with is pretty unfixable. It's not like orthopedic surgery. You break a leg, you screw it back together or whatever they do.
Yeah.
um, they it seems similar in HR, and then what we are left with is approaches or ways of, like methodologies as opposed to fixes. And so when you're
Yeah.
dealing with so much angst because of a macroeconomic issue, what are some of your approaches? How do you talk to the company? How do you talk to people about it? How do you help people through it?
Yeah. Yeah, the tricky part with all of that is, so my experience is that you have to meet people and the organization in the place they're in. So that leads to more practical approaches. So because when you're looking at an economic environment you can't control, but you can see the pressures that are present on managers and employees and the senior executive team. um, you, you're kind of bound within those certain set of circumstances and building strategies that actually work in those circumstances. And so, and that's what I mean by meeting the organization and people where they are. So one of the things that at Canada Cartage we've been concentrating on very carefully is our employee engagement. And so we just did our we've done engagement surveys in the past, but over COVID, it sort of let up. We weren't keeping tabs on that. And so last year we did our first engagement survey in a while, and then this year the second engagement survey. But what's come out of that is we've made some pretty big improvements on how we communicate with employees and how we've asked managers to communicate with employees and how we recognize employees. And that leads to a connection in the workplace. And so one of the big things that came up out of this was I really like working with my teams. I really like working with my manager. And that's something that, internally, we've actually created an informal support network as a result of that. So even in the face of these economic challenges, our employees are actually bonding together with their leaders and doing everyday business. And it's helped with retention and engagement overall, but also helping with the support overall of the employees. And there are stats out there that say if you've got a friend in the workplace, there's much more likelihood of you actually staying in the workplace. So it lends itself to dealing with these types of issues.
So what I'm hearing is that those like smaller communities are very important for engagement, even I would imagine retention and wellness. The the question has to come up. Does that it does it happen by accident? I know we'll say, yeah, we have the strategy and these values and is some of it luck? Is some of it recruitment? Where do you put that? In terms of, wow, we have really good little micro communities happening at Cartage.
Yeah, I don't think any of it's really luck. Like if you were to go, okay, well, what are our values? And at the end of the day, you'll always hear people say, well, it doesn't matter if you have values or you've got the culture, like in terms of creating those groups, like people will fill those gaps themselves. The question is, how do you anchor it? And so that's where all the values come in. It's like stated values and stated, desires and reinforced desires. And so um, I would say that not accidental. You have to have the right environment to actually create those microcosms. And so I think that's the key piece to it. We weren't like we're in a traditional industry. Like Canada Cartage is, I think, it's well over 100 years old, and so very traditional. The transport industry is very traditional. Like the company started off with a horse and a cart, right? And so there's a lot of history there that we anchor to, but on the other side of it, you can lose your way quickly in this traditional industry with, authoritarian type of management style and that sort of thing. And we are, I think, every industry has been moving towards a more collaborative style, just because of the desires of the generations in the workforce. So the whole idea is just enable this environment where people can interact in a way that's constructive, that makes them look forward to coming to work. So
How powerful is that origin story, the horse and the cart? I find that really striking. And I'm reading
Mhm.
I don't know, it's a well-known book, Sapiens, and it really talks about how we wouldn't have become human without two things. Well, in our current organization of humans, without the agricultural revolution and the cognitive revolution. The cognitive revolution was just all
Mhm.
about myths and how we got to believe in uh, gods and myths and stories. And I think some
Yeah.
of the best organizations have the cleanest and simplest origin story, and it creates the best culture because you can always think, well, I should do whatever it takes because the founder started this with a horse and buggy. Like, is that something that is referenced often? Because I think that's a really interesting thing for that organization, that it started with such humble roots.
Yeah. I mean, this is something I can speak personally about this. So the last organization I worked in was a Canadian organization, had a Canadian roots across the country. And that's very similar to the Canada Cartage story. To me, I had never necessarily aimed for transport as my next kind of organization. What was compelling to me was when I sat down with the CEO when I was interviewing for the role, Canada Cartage had a different value proposition than many of the other companies that I'd had discussions with. And it was, we've grown through a family orientation. We, had a number of different owners that built the company over time, created this pride. That pride is emulated through the company. Um, and and you can tell that the employees really identify with that. So, and like, for example, we've had for years what we call the 25-year club. These are employees that have been with us for over 25 years and retirees that are invited back for a dinner every year that identify with the company. And I have awesome conversations with these folks, and it's all about the good old days and when, they were driving for Sears and all these other things. But that's the long story to say, the more you can leverage that compelling story, that identity with the company, it creates purpose and it creates kind of pride in what the employees do every single day. That creates that level of engagement overall. So,
That's very interesting, and especially with engagement, because when you think about engagement or discretionary effort, you can do the bare minimum, and we're always playing a tape in our heads of like, what is the gain if I
yeah.
do more, if I stay late, if I don't know, I'm more rigorous with safety protocols. What is the gain for me? That's just how our minds are built. I hope so. Maybe I'm the only
Yeah.
sociopath here that thinks like that. But I think that's how we're built. And so to attach that back to a narrative that's so simple and strong, it must help with engagement.
It does, absolutely. And I think you're right. I think you're going down the road of, how do you, at the end of the day, the company needs to maintain profitability, and that's something that as executives we can't lose sight of. And we all have bosses. Even the CEO has a boss, right? It's the board and it's the stakeholders. But, so the the kind of motivation behind a for-profit enterprise is that to keep on making profit and keeping up with industry and providing those jobs, right? And so while we can't lose sight of that, um, that discretionary effort is so key to the performance of the organization. So the more we can harness that discretionary effort, the better the organization will perform and the more successful it will be and the better off the employees will be. So it's kind of all follows that cycle, but you're absolutely right. Like that discretionary effort is absolutely what we're always after. And success breeds success. So that continues to snowball and creates more engagement and so on and so forth. It's really planting the seeds of, all those practices that keep people engaged in the beginning steps. So,
What are the challenges right now in transport? I imagine that you're seeing fewer drivers. It's harder to retain, engage. I imagine that the professional driving space even is more of a commodity now. What challenges are you seeing with that space? Because it's traditional and the world is changing rapidly. I imagine it's not gone unscathed.
yep, you're correct. So, I mentioned we've been in a pretty tough economic time for the transportation industry, and we're surviving it better than most, I would say. Um, with that, so if I go back to what transportation was and maybe what it is, that will provide some context. So transportation is a like the integral part of the supply chain and moving goods from place to place was always seen as, a career. And that's what we see in some of our more senior drivers out there, that this has been their career their whole lives, and they've um, provided for their families and so on and so forth. And what we've seen more so now is a shift away from the career, long-term employee to, younger employees that have more, I guess, they turn over a little bit faster. They're trying to make their way, and we draw significantly on new immigrants, just as a good workforce to uh, to fulfill our services to our customers. So with new immigrants, the idea is that they're looking to work hard, get ahead, do what they need to do every day to provide for their families. But it is a slightly different lens than those more senior drivers that we've had, or those drivers that have had more service. So we do suffer more turnover and more retention issues, but we've got things like referral programs and other initiatives that allow us to kind of combat that. In the recent year, because of the downturn in the economy, from a trends perspective, we've had probably a little bit more retention and so on and so forth. But it has definitely changed the industry. The other part of that is economically, through COVID, there was a ramp up, if you remember, of all these supply chain issues. We couldn't provide enough goods fast enough, right? And with that came the inflationary pressures, and and we're not alone in this. We've had a situation where there are downward pressures in prices now. There are up for companies to provide better contracts and reduce their costs to their customers. But you have these inflationary pressures on employees who are saying, like, I've had, over the last few years, my cost of living has gone up exponentially. And so now there's wage pressures coming up. So it's a very difficult time to manage in the industry. And so what really makes the difference is, and one of the reasons we really revived this whole concept around employee engagement and culture, is just to combat that. We want to be a good place to work. We want to keep people there, and it's just, and recognize that it's just difficult for employees because of those inflationary pressures. So
Can you speak to engagement in a highly decentralized work environment? It's not like you can roll out
yes,
I don't know, a leaderboard app competition and everyone's on their phone, and it's very hard to you have so many employees. They're across the
yeah,
country. It has to be one of the most decentralized because it's literally transportation. How do you engage?
yeah. Well, engagement and management of employees all happens at the front line. So the supervisor and middle manager are always um, the first line of engagement. So, and you always hear that, employees don't leave their company; they actually leave their managers, and that is so true. So, you know, the big part about kind of improving engagement or keeping it at a high level is making sure that the managers and supervisors have the tools to um, and the knowledge to be able to actually do that engagement activity. So we can drive it all we want from a corporate level, but if we don't have really solid supervisors and managers in play that connect with the employees every single day, then any initiatives will actually fail.
Yeah. So that they're the key to everything. Supervisors and managers who are actually interfacing with the hundreds of employees. Okay. That makes sense. And I think too, there's something with we've been able to scale safety. I'm coming at this from a perspective of mental health training because we
Sure.
had we
Sure.
had early on struggled to engage professional drivers, kind of distanced workforces, road construction, unless something was mandatory and the company said you have to do this or you can't work here. Like respect in the workplace training is a common example. But
Yeah.
that doesn't really engender warm, fuzzy, I love working here feelings either when you say you have to do something and your manager makes you do something. So we wrestled with this a lot with some of our early
Yeah.
organizations, and the way that we start to think about it is a lot like safety is now thought about. Like mental health is now in that picture, kind of that safety picture. But I still
Yes,
think
of
there's
course.
challenges in engaging that frontline workforce when it comes to something that I think is important, obviously mental health and safety. Um, but something like engagement or other campaigns, I could see there still being a lot of challenges.
Yeah, for sure. Like it's interesting how the continuum has worked through through the relationship. You bring up an interesting point around the safety side and the mental health side, and so I managed the safety side at my last organization, and respect in the workplace was definitely a part of that, and it links directly through health and safety legislation. So there's sort of this reinforcement connection there. Um, but you think about this whole concept of psychological safety and the traditional ways of managing there are, when I talk about providing managers and supervisors with the skills, there are some supervisors and managers who default to a command and control type of approach. And that's maybe for lack of training. It could be, just the way their personalities are. There's just lots of different factors that actually contribute to that. But the question becomes, from a mental health or engagement or whatever it is, that approach is so integral to all of those factors, whether it be mental health um, or it's an engagement, angle, where that becomes not acceptable in the workplace anymore. And so, in whether you're in construction, manufacturing, transportation, it's those are that's the way the world is shifting now. So I think there are additional challenges though in a male dominated workplace where, you've got the kind of the I don't want to admit that there's a mental health problem. I don't want to admit that I'm being broken down by toxic behavior or, those types of things. So it's important that supervisors and managers recognize that early, or if the managers or supervisors are participating in that they're kind of re-steered onto the right paths. So
Yeah, I've heard the term testosterone forward work environments. And I think that was good. I forget
yeah.
where I heard that. I think it was a construction group that we worked with. But yeah, there's something about the the male psyche also that wants to project toughness, doesn't impact me, I don't need it. And I just wonder if that's changing. And I guess this is the core question for you. The changes you've seen over the last 20 years, they have to be massive. They have to be monumental in terms of the role of HR and the people industry. Can you speak to that in the context of psychological safety and mental health and even stigma or ideals around masculinity? What are the big tent changes that you've seen in the last 20 years?
Yeah, it's interesting. I did this interview with the CBC at one point with Diane Buckner, and it was, I don't know, I want to say it was somewhere between 2003 and 2006, somewhere in there. And she was starting to go down this path of mental health. And she said to me, why do you think there are more reports of mental health? And I said, well, at the time, it's, you have again, this comes back down to changing environments and pressures and all these other things that kind of cause mental health issues, or but issues that people are have it ebbs and flows, and some days they're not feeling so great and some days they're okay. And I just said to her, like, part of it is that you've got that environmental factor, and then part of it is we're recognizing that this is becoming a problem, and so there's more acceptance around the discussion now. That was back then. Over that time period to now, there's been even more talk about self-care and mental health, and more acceptance about what society will talk about, and recognize as a mental health issue. So I can give the example of, when you talk about a safe environment. We had at one of my roles, we had a person who was transgender and was making transition from male to female in a male dominated workplace. So this was a huge issue. And so, fortunately, this person had the courage to come out and say to his leader and to the HR group, look, I've got this thing going on, and I'm going to be at the point where I'm going to be taking on a new name and a different persona. And I think I need some help here. Well, if that had ever happened, it would be a miracle for that to have happened in the 90s, right? Or into the early 2000s. That's a really tough conversation to have. So we've come a long way, certainly not far enough, but a long way to having those discussions around mental health issues and how we deal with them openly in the workplace and in a constructive manner. So you hope that people come earlier rather than later, and it avoids all sorts of problems in terms of absenteeism and productivity. And, you know, sometimes people end up self-medicating because of those issues. And all of those things are, in a lot of cases can be prevented because they haven't got help in the midst of their crises or their challenges. So.
Can you, and I really wanted to ask about that too, because I couldn't agree more. I don't think we're having this conversation even. Like, even when I started my residency, the conversations around mental health in the workplace were almost non-existent. I remember there was a couple of consultants in the space. Now there's a whole ecosystem of supports and training and help, and stigma has been so reduced. And I just wonder, like, what now is getting in the way of people reaching out for help? Like, what more can we do as I don't know, a field to reduce stigma even further? I would say with the generation, what am I, Gen X? I'm a millennial. So Gen Z or Z, like, there's almost no stigma. It's, in some ways, it's celebrated at times, and that's okay. Like, they're celebrating neurodiversity and having ADHD and struggling with conflict, and that's on social media. So I just wonder, like, at this point, I don't think it's stigma. And what do you think it is that is stopping people from reaching out? Is it a lack of care? Is it a comfort with it? Is it still stigma? I just don't think it is stigma anymore.
Yeah, I think you're a product of your environment as well. So maybe stigma, maybe not stigma. I think in some cases it's uh, people, who don't recognize necessarily that things are on a downward slide, and it doesn't happen. We talk about mental health like it happens in a heartbeat. And I've gone from this to this, which is bad. And we all of a sudden kind of say, oh, well, now I need help. Well, it doesn't happen that way. It happens on, there are critical moments for sure, but in a lot of cases, it happens on a steady downward decline, and people kind of are just living their life, right? We all tend to live in our world, our own worlds to some extent. And maybe people don't recognize it as much. And then you have other factors. So when I talk about product of environment, I'll go back to the transportation industry. So Drivers, for example, some of the issues there are isolation, right? So not having the ability to actually engage with a professional. Like we just put in, we segmented our mental health benefit with out of paramedical into its own kind of bucket in our benefit plan. And then we introduced virtual healthcare. So drivers have more access now than they ever did. So they can get a prescription or whatever it is they need while they're on the road. And so that isolation it creates an issue for people getting help. But transportation is not the only area that happens. I think it might happen where people are just, so the economic pressures, they may be working a side hustle, right? So they've got their full-time gig and then they go home and then they turn around and they go into their part-time retail gig, right? And so that creates issues around time and pressures in life and so on and so forth that then contributes to people not being able to get the help that they need.
Yeah, I didn't actually think about the isolation. That must be very real. And I grew up in a small town, and I just remember that there was always these long haul truckers out parked at the gas station, and they would sleep there at night, and then they would, go grab something from the gas station and like go another whatever, I don't know, 8 or 12 hours throughout the day. You have to be of a certain mindset and embrace that isolation because I think it'd be it could be a very lonely life too.
Yeah, and some love it, right?
Yeah.
Some are just that's what they like to do. Others, may not, or run into these kind of crises or issues or challenges where they don't have that help. So the isolation is a big factor. And if you've ever stopped to talk to a truck driver, not all of them, but many of them will talk your ear off. So they do crave that kind of interaction and that. So it's it is a challenge, but it is in other it's definitely that in other industries as well. So
Yeah, I had that experience with farmers. I grew up in a farming community, and there's always this situation where in the middle of the street, two obviously looking farm trucks would stop, and you'd have to go around them because they're talking. They have their windows rolled down. They're talking to each other. They might be there for 2 hours, and the traffic just
yeah,
kind of moseys on around around those two trucks.
yeah,
That's
absolutely.
another industry where they face, the yearning for social connection. Yeah, Stephen, thanks for doing this, man. This was a super interesting discussion. Very insightful because your industry is under pressure, and you've had this experience of over 20 years. And so, thanks for bringing that experience to bear with our listeners. And I really appreciate you taking some time today.
Yeah, no, thanks for having me. It's been an absolute pleasure.